Hello guys, I'm Herman Singh, joined with Manvir Singh today. We're going to be talking about the Ghadri Babay, their movement and party, along with their impact both here in the United States and South Asia and the Indian independence and everything they did. So Manvir, what do you know about the Ghadri Babay?
Yeah, not much. I know that there were a group of Punjabis that came to California in the early 1900s, and a lot of which were Berkeley students. And they created this group that was basically trying to create the vision of what they saw India as independent from the British, because at the time it was ruled by the British.
Yeah, so that pretty much is a good overview of what they were. They were predominantly Punjabi Sikhs, and they were predominantly here in the West Coast. Many of them were Berkeley students. Many of them were also Stanford students. And then many of them were also laborers. And there were many in Vancouver area also. So the official Ghadar Party itself was formed in 1913 on July 15th in Astoria, Oregon. The founding president was a man by the name of Singh Buckna, along with a couple other prominent members at the time. There was Bhagwan Singh Gyani, Har Dayal, and Bhagat Singh Thind. And you were pretty right on their aim. The aim of the Ghadar Party was to get rid of the British rule in India. But the one big difference between them and like the Gandhi and the Congress Party was that they wanted to do it with an armed struggle. And another big thing at the time was this idea of like a dominion state. That's how you would categorize like Canada and Australia today, meaning that Canada and Australia are autonomous. They have their own governments, their own prime ministers, and they make all their own laws. However, technically, the head of state is still the crown, right? You'll see the queen on their dollar bills. So the Ghadar Party did not want this for India. Mm-hmm. They did not want this dominion state, whereas Congress at that time in the early 1900s did.
Okay.
Yeah, so the biggest thing they did was they started this weekly publication, and they called it The Ghadar. Do you know what Ghadar means?
Ghadar means, doesn't it mean like a revolution?
Yeah, it means like revolt, revolution, rebellion. So yeah, so like that, they're the Ghadar Party. They're fighting for rebellion. So they started this weekly publication called The Ghadar. It was originally in Urdu and Punjabi, and then later they added Hindi. And they actually moved down to San Francisco, and they started on Hill Street. And then a little while later, they moved over to Wood Street, where today stands a Ghadar Memorial here in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. It's a museum along with the library, and you can see a lot of their early publications along with many of their other things there. I've personally never been, but I do want to see it one day. Have you been to it or heard of it?
No, I've never seen it, heard of it, any of that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really cool, and it's right here in San Francisco, right? Like, we should go someday.
Yeah, so when they founded this group, was their intention, do you know how it got founded? Like, was their intention they were going to come here and create this, or was it kind of like they came here and they met each other and decided to create this group called the Ghadar Party?
Yeah, I think it's kind of both. You know, a lot of them have been fighting for independence in India. You have mutinies that happen in the mid-1800s in India. And a lot of these guys don't want to be in British India. So mm-hmm. they come over to the West, they come over to Canada, they come over to America. Many of them are in Singapore, many of them in England, some of them in Berlin and in Europe. So they didn't want to be a part of that, but they also wanted India to be free, and they wanted the Indians to run India. So it kind of goes hand in hand. A lot of them are also young, a lot of them are also educated, and a lot of them are, wanting revolution. So it's kind of just a lot of like-minded individuals got together, and they're in this Western world. This is over 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. They don't know many people, so you kind of gravitate towards people you speak your mother language with.
Yeah, so 1900s, you said that there's a lot of Indian, a lot of Punjabi people emigrating to Canada, parts of Cali, Singapore. What is the main motivation? Why did they leave? Was it to get a better life, or their political frustrations?
I think it's both. If anything, I'd argue it might be more on the getting a better life side, and many of them were economic reasons for them leaving India, and then also the education opportunities here. Many of them got accepted to Berkeley and then came, so they were coming here for education reasons. A lot of prominent revolutionaries you'll see were educated in the West. Gandhi, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and these guys.
So Would you say most of these people that were coming to these different countries, were a lot of them coming for getting a better life and working, or were they trying to become students?
Um, I think both. They wanted to become educated, and they probably were going to stay here, and some of them do go back.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a mix. But getting back to the Ghadar Party and their newspaper, right away their publication gets pretty famous. They're writing these weekly pamphlets in which they're talking about revolution, in which they're talking about Ghadar, in which they're talking about a free India, and their main goal was to spread their message. So they're shipping them all throughout America. They're also sending them to India. So these reach, the shores of India. They get to Bombay, they get to Bengal, they get to Punjab, and they're banned right away. And Britain at the time actually tells United States, hey, you got these group of guys over there that are talking about revolution in India. And America just kind of pauses and says, well, that's not against our laws. They're
Right.
technically not breaking American laws. So you weren't allowed to, say Inqilab Zindabad in India, but here in America you could. So that was also a pretty big reason a lot of them were coming here.
Okay, so America's like position was neutral, like let
Yeah,
them do
at
their
the
thing.
time. Yeah, it's not illegal for you to want independence in India while living in America,
Right.
right? And on top of that, these meetings are being held in San Francisco. The Ghadri Babay are holding meetings there. They're also in Los Angeles. They're also in Vancouver. They're also in Washington, D.C. There's also meetings in Oxford and Vienna and Berlin, out in Shanghai and Singapore. So it's kind of like these small pockets of like-minded individuals all throughout the world. But the epicenter is here in California, is here in San Francisco. And then I was going to ask you, we talked about Canada and immigrants earlier. Do you know about and I may mispronounce this, but do you know about the Komagatu Maru incident?
Yeah, a little bit. I think it was a ship coming from somewhere full of immigrants, Indian immigrants, and then they reached the dock of, I think, somewhere in Canada,
Yeah.
and they just refused it. And that was like a huge issue at that time.
Yeah, so a lot of these immigrants are coming to Canada and America. And at the time, there is a lot of anti-Asian sentiment in both Canada and America. And it's not only towards, South Asians, it's also towards Eastern
Yeah.
Asians. And at the time, there is a big ship, the Komagata Maru, which is being sent from Singapore. A guy by the name of Baba Gurdit Singh commissions it. And in there is about 400 Indians, predominantly Punjabi Sikhs. I want to say close to 80%, 75%. And they go from Singapore all the way to Vancouver. And once they get to Vancouver, they're not allowed to get off. And they're saying, wait, we're not going to go back. So there's kind of this standoff, and I don't know exactly how long it takes, but it's a couple weeks. And there's actually a plot for them to get guns and to, kind of, force their way
Right.
in. And one of the guys, I forgot his name, I think it's like Mera Singh or something, he has a plot to get a bunch of guns from America. He crosses the border from Vancouver into America, Washington. He gets some guns, and he actually is caught, and he's later tried and hung in Canada.
Oh, wow. So they're trying to organize a riot while they're basically getting refused.
Kind of, yeah. And also at the time, there was a Gurdwara. There were Gurdwara in Vancouver. And, they're saying, hey, some of our guys are on that ship, So I think something like 24 of them were able to get off, but the majority of them were sent back.
Oh, wow.
And
Sent back to Singapore.
Yeah, sent back to Singapore. And then from Singapore, they're sent back to Bengal. And then again, they refuse to get off. And there's actually a shoot-off. There's some shooting that happens there in Calcutta and Bengal. And I think somewhere around the lines of 25 of them die.
Man.
So this is a really big moment in this whole, India independence movement. And at this moment, a lot of Canadian Sikhs decide, wait a second, like, we don't want to live here. Maybe we should go back and join these Ghadri Babay and fight for independence in India.
Yeah, so this whole issue of them getting refused at the port, did it like help gain momentum in the whole movement that the Ghadri Babay were trying to do?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it is unfortunate that they weren't able to, get off the ship. But at the same time, yeah, it definitely did motivate, and it definitely did bring a lot of them to the fight. It did bring a lot of these predominantly Punjabi Sikhs in Canada decide either to sell their businesses and move back, or they decide to now start, monetarily funding the Ghadri Babay and what they were fighting for. And then there's a young guy by the name of Ghadar Singh Sarabha. And he's actually a student at Berkeley, and he's a Ghadri Babay himself. And he's one of these guys that decides, I want to go back to India and I want to fight for independence. So he, drops out of Berkeley, and he finds himself in Bengal. And he actually gets caught up in a bunch of these conspiracies. So essentially, the Ghadar Party was trying to have an armed struggle. And secondly, their main objective was, hey, there's a lot of Indian soldiers in the British armed forces, and a lot of them are like-minded. A lot of them would also want their own country. If we can convince these soldiers to join us, we could already have an army. All we got to do is cause a mutiny, right?
Right.
So that's what this guy, Ghadar Singh Sarabha, goes back to India, and he gets caught. There's unfortunately a lot of British informants within their ranks, and we're going to see this over and over and over again. And he gets caught, and he's actually put on trial for trying to start a mutiny against Britain, right? And he is actually given the chance to, leave that trial. He's actually said, like, hey, you weren't one of the main three guys. We're trying these two. And he actually stands there and says, no, I'm going to stay part of this trial. I was part of it. And during the trial itself, he has no remorse. He's being tried for, conspiracy against the British government, also for sedition and being a traitor. And he says, look, and it's a very famous quote. He says, every slave has the right to revolt. And this guy, those words echo throughout India, throughout the Ghadar movement. And actually Bhagat Singh himself, Shaheed Bhagat Singh, said that he always kept a photo of Ghadar Singh Sarabha in his pocket.
Wow.
And, so this guy, this is years prior to what Bhagat Singh does. He's influencing these other revolutionaries. And also he himself is hung, and he's a Shaheed at age 19.
That's amazing, because at age 19, you have to think about, like, for somebody to make that statement to say, hey, I can leave, but I'm going to stay and fight for what I believe in. I think that was a really big inspiration for a lot of people to join the movement.
Yeah, definitely. And Shaheed Bhagat Singh is arguably, one of the most famous revolutionaries in the Indian struggle. And he looked up to this guy, right?
Yeah, so speaking of Bhagat Singh, where does Bhagat Singh and Udham Singh come into all of this?
Yeah, so actually Udham Singh himself was actually a Ghadri Babay, and most people don't know this, right? So for those of you listening that don't know who Udham Singh is, there was in, I think, 1919, the Jallianwala Bagh, also known as the Amritsar Massacre. So this is actually about 5 years removed from where we are with Ghadar Singh Sarabha. 5 years after that, just because you asked the question. In Amritsar, there's a lot of protest happening. There's a lot of laws the British have imposed that kind of say, hey, we're getting rid of a lot of your rights. So in Amritsar, there's a big protest happening at the Jallianwala Bagh. It's really close to Herman, the Golden Temple. And General Dyer decides to, just mow down all the protesters with machine guns. And he kills, I think, somewhere around 400 people.
Yeah, so for the audience that doesn't know the significance of Jallianwala Bagh, it's actually a very big moment in the Indian Revolution history.
Yeah.
Because it was basically this area, which was called Jallianwala Bagh, and it was a peaceful gathering. Basically, it was just a lot of people gathering to discuss the position and opposition to British rule. And that's when, the British found out that they're organizing it, and they blocked off the only entrance in and out and literally organized a military exercise to massacre everybody. And I think that had a huge significance in Bhagat Singh and Udham Singh's life.
Yeah, so for Udham Singh at the time, he's a young guy growing up in that general Amritsar area. But what ends up happening is he actually gets to America. And this is a part, I watched his movie. It's not even in the movie. I actually read a book called The Patient Assassin by a journalist of the name of Anita Anand, I think, and we can link the book. It came out a couple years ago. It's a really good book, and I encourage everybody to read it. But in that book, she talks about how Uddham Singh finds himself in America and California, actually in LA, where we're sitting right now.
That's wild.
And he's in Hollywood trying to become a movie star at one point, I think. And you can actually see, I think it's called The Elephant Boy. He's an extra in that movie. You can see Uddham Singh in that movie.
I had no idea. That's crazy.
Yeah, so I believe he came to America for economic reasons, and he ends up, meeting the Ghadri Babay. He ends up living at the Stockton Gurdwara, and it's there that he realizes that he wants to join the fight. And it's there that he decides to kill it's actually Lieutenant Governor O. Dwyer. So the guy who's the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab at the time that okayed the Jallianwala Bagh to happen. And then Uddham Singh himself later goes on and he flies over to England and he pulls out a pistol and he kills Lieutenant Governor O'Dwyer. And to this day, he's heralded as a revolutionary.
Yeah.
He's there's cities and districts named after him in other states, not even just Punjab.
Yeah.
So actually Uddham Singh himself was a Ghadri Baba, and that's not something you probably knew or most people.
I didn't know. I know for Uddham Singh, it's a very big name in Indian Revolution, but he's the one, when he assassinated him, that was the cutout that he had a pistol in a book, I think, a law book or something that he was going to. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting story. And yeah, Uddham Singh himself was actually a Ghadri Baba. And then you mentioned Bhagat Singh. So Bhagat Singh kind of rise to fame was a bit after, which is actually the next story. We're going to talk about the Ghadar conspiracy. But if you guys remember in our episode on Deep Sidhu, we talked about Bhagat Singh's chacha, a guy by the name of Sardar Ajit Singh Sandhu. Do you remember that? He was the guy that led the original farmers' protest over 100 years ago against Britain. So Ajit Singh is a leader during that time. So he's a leader against the farmers' protest against Britain. And then he actually finds himself in California. And he was also a Ghadri Baba, right? So he was linked with a lot of these guys. And when he goes back to Punjab and, with Bhagat Singh, that's his nephew, they live in the same house. They're talking and discussing these very same topics. He had the pamphlets of the Ghadri Baba, he was one. And Sardar Ajit Singh is actually very interesting because he will, get exiled at one point. And then later he also joins Netaji Bose, which was a pretty prominent figure later in the World War II era because he joins Hitler. So Ajit Singh kind of finds himself in three very prominent different events.
Wow. So would you say that Bhagat Singh was directly or indirectly influenced by the values of the Ghadri Babay?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, he was influenced by them, and in fact, he talks about being influenced by them. And he kept a photo of Kartar Singh Sarabha in his pocket. These were the guys he looked up to. These shaheeds that gave their life at a very young age for India, which he will then later do. But yeah, so after kind of getting back, it's the early 1900s. And World War I breaks out. So World War I to these Ghadri Babay feels like the perfect time to formally declare war against Britain. And that's what they do. In their Ghadar issue dated August 5, 1914, they formally declare war on Britain.
Wow.
And yeah, it's a pretty big thing. And, retrospectively, that means that they are aligned with Germany, which is a bit complicated, looking back at that, history. But it's kind of more like, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. Right. Like they don't necessarily care who's involved, but, there's a big world war and somebody's against Britain. So we want to align with them.
Yeah, you got to pick a side that would go with the values that they had.
Yeah, and at the time, actually, Germany declares their own government of India. Had you heard about this?
No.
So they call it the Provisional Government of India or Free India. I mean, it's kind of like this government in exile, and they're based out of Kabul, Afghanistan. And, they're propped up by the Central Powers. They're propped up by, Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire. And they actually, have an election, and they decide on a president and a prime minister. So the president was a gentleman by the name of Pratap Singh, and the prime minister is a guy by the name of Mohammed Bhopali,
Mm-hmm.
and they are the leaders of this, provisional government for the duration of World War One. And the interesting thing, and it's a very complicated and history, but Pratap Singh at this moment is the president of this free India, propped up by Germany. But then, so many years later, after India actually gets independence in 47, Pratap Singh becomes a member of parliament. So, looking through our American lens, it's pretty crazy to see, somebody siding with Germany in World War One.
Right.
But, through an Indian lens, to them, these guys were revolutionaries. And even though they stood with Germany at that time, they were still fighting for us.
Yeah.
And
So this provisional government in India. So the timeline goes. The Ghadri Babay World War One happens.
yeah.
Ghadri Babay declare war with Britain. Right. Declaration of war. What was the purpose of the provisional government of India that was founded by Germany? Like, was it like a backup government in case British?
Yeah, so it's essentially saying, hey, Indians, side with us. When we win, we're giving you your own country,
Mm,
right? And you're kind of probably wondering, how did the Ghadri Babay and Pratap Singh and these guys ever get aligned with Germany, right?
right.
And it's because while this Ghadar movement is happening predominantly in the West, in America, there's similar organizations in other countries. In England, they very famously had a place called the India House. And it's a lot of these, less Punjabis. There were Punjabis there, but a lot of Bengali revolutionaries coming out of there, writing similar things. They didn't have the same publication that the Ghadri Babay had, but they were fighting for the similar cause. And then in Berlin, there's something called the Berlin Committee. And earlier I mentioned a founding member of the Ghadri Babay, Har Dayal. He was a leader in the Berlin Committee. So that's actually a direct link right there. He was a founding member of the Ghadar Party, and he's also a leader in Berlin. And that's kind of the direct link. They're this big group of Indians fighting for independence in Berlin, and they go to Germany and say, hey, give us this provisional government of India, and we'll give you British Indian soldiers to fight alongside with you.
I see.
And that's when we get to what's known as the Ghadar Mutiny, or also known as the Ghadar Conspiracy. So during World War One, in February 15, the Ghadri Babay, for quite a time, have been, sending their pamphlets all over India and encouraging Indians to stand with their cause of a free India. And they decide to have a mutiny. So they're trying to encourage Indian soldiers to, give up arms with Britain and fight for them, fight for India. And they're trying to organize this, and it's estimated, I think, something along 8,000, in English we call them Ghadriites or Ghadri Babay, come back to Punjab and India to do this. And they're, Punjabis all throughout the military, and at that time there's a lot of, Sikh regiment, the Jat regiment. So they're hoping that a lot of these regiments will switch. There's also a lot of prominent Bengali freedom fighters that have also joined this mission. It was actually the Ghadri Babay actually landed in Calcutta in Bengal. So Bengal and Punjab always kind of had a hand together in things throughout this.
Yeah.
And you'll see that later in history too. But the mutiny itself happens on February 15th, and much of it is actually caught by informants that tell the British officers prior. So much of it doesn't happen. Many of the infantry units they were trying to have do a mutiny did not do it.
So the recruitment of these military members was not well received.
Well, it wasn't that it wasn't well received. It's more so that, it's such a big task. It's so hard to keep it organized, and it's so hard not to have spies amongst your midst. And, we're talking 8,000 of these guys came back to India. Some of them will be aligned with Britain. And on February 15th, in 1915, the 5th Light Infantry of Singapore, along with the Malay State Guides. So that was kind of like the National Guard of Singapore, kind of like the Sikh. It's almost predominantly Sikhs. It was a Sikh police force. So this Light Infantry of Singapore, along with the Sikh police force, they actually do a mutiny. And it lasted about 7 days. They killed 47 British soldiers, and they take control of that area.
Mm.
And they actually released prisoners of war
Oh,
that
wow.
Britain had kept there. So it's a really big deal. And it isn't until Britain is able to bring ships with reinforcements that they're able to, put down this mutiny.
Yeah, regain control.
Yeah, and unfortunately for the Ghadri Party, they weren't able to have other big mutinies. There were, small pockets, but nothing to the scale of this one. And the British are able to, put them down, and 200 of these infantry soldiers are tried, and 47 of them are shot in a public execution manner. And I believe it's it's because 47 British soldiers died during it. They're killing
So
47.
essentially making a statement.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the rest of them were either deported or given pretty lengthy 20, 30-year jail sentences. So this was pretty much the biggest moment of the Indian independence movement at this time, led by the Ghadri Babay. And that was this Ghadar conspiracy, this Ghadar mutiny. And its ramifications are still being felt today. It's kind of like they wanted these soldiers to fight for the people rather than fighting for this government, the British government. And it's kind of this idea that, there's camaraderie between the soldiers and the common people over the overarching power. And you still see that idea, you saw a lot of soldiers protesting in the farmers movement,
Right.
This last year. But along with that, there's actually a very famous trial that happens in America. It's called the Hindu-German conspiracy trial. And essentially up until this point, it wasn't illegal for the Indian Americans to want independence. But once they aligned themselves with Germany, then it became, America's at war with Germany, right? So
America looked at them like, you're picking sides with our enemies, and now you're our enemy.
Exactly. So up until World War I, it wasn't illegal, but at that moment it becomes illegal, and 8 Indians are tried in America, in San Francisco. They're indicted by a federal grand jury for a charge of conspiracy to form military enterprise against the United Kingdom. And also they're charged with gun running. That's something I didn't mention earlier, but there were a lot of guns being bought by the Ghadri Babay in both America and Canada, and being sent with them in the ships when they got to India. Along with that, the American public, however, supported these Indian nationals. So Britain
didn't the British want to deport them to try them in Britain?
Yeah, so that's exactly what happens. Britain wants to deport them. However, there's such strong support in favor of these, Indians, Punjabis, by the American people. The American Department of Justice decides to have the trial in America. And during this trial, it's a very lengthy trial. It starts November 12th, 1917, and it ends April 24th, 1918. So, sorry, it starts November 12th, 1917, and it ends April 24th, 1918. And during this trial, the defense argued that these Ghadri Babay were fighting for their beliefs, and their beliefs are in line with American ideals.
Right.
And they're specifically in line with American revolutionaries. And they actually showed copies of the Ghadar, the publication, where there were quotes from, guys like Patrick Henry, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln.
It's a pretty strong defense.
Yeah, and the trial itself was pretty wild. There was actually 2 defendants killed in the actual trial. Yeah. So
how were they killed? Who killed them?
So there's 2 defendants, one by the name, they're both actually named Ram, one by the name of Ram Chandra, and the other by the name of Ram Singh. So I'm actually just going to read excerpt from the actual trial. Ram Chandra arose and started across the room. Ram Singh also arose. He raised his revolver and began firing. Ram Chandra staggered forward and fell dead before the witness chair, with a bullet in his heart and 2 others in his body. While Singh still pressed the trigger of his automatic pistol, he too was shot and killed by United States Marshal James H. Houlihan, who fired across the room over the heads of the attorneys. Yeah,
That's wild.
it's definitely, it's a sensational trial happening in San Francisco, and Chandra was murdered by Ram Singh, because the Ram Singh accused him of using the money they were gathering for his own personal purposes.
Okay, so they were both in the same
Yeah,
party.
they're both defendants in this case. There was 8 of them, so these 2 pass away. One kills the other, and then the marshal, the U.S. marshal, kills him. But the trial does end, and the judge found the defendants guilty of violating the neutrality of the United States, and they were sentenced to 22 months of jail time.
Mm-hmm.
And the public at the time, it was stated in the press that, the Indians, the students, and the revolutionaries, many of them highly educated, are sentenced to serve 22 months for fighting for revolution. So it wasn't necessarily viewed negatively. Of course, the trial itself with the murder and the killing was, a bit crazy. But that's kind of where this story ends. The Ghadri Babay do continue to fight for revolution. They do support up until, the actual independence, and they don't dissolve until after independence. But their biggest moment in history was definitely this Ghadar conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
But many of them, joined different parties. Some of them become more on the communist side. There is a big communist uprising all around the world. Bhagat Singh himself was, Shaheed Bhagat Singh was a communist. So it's quite interesting. And another big point, you and I sit here in Los Angeles, and when we think of the Indian Revolution and independence, we think of something that's so far away.
Right.
And yet such a big piece of that happened here in California where we sit, 100 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of times when we talk about these historical movements, we can remove ourselves from it because it's so far away. But it's here. It's in LA. It's in Stockton. It's literally where we grew up and where we live.
Yeah. And another big thing that at least I've seen in the media and by partisan politicians in India is they kind of put this, they kind of blame NRIs,
Mm-hmm.
non-resident Indians, guys like, we're considered that, people who are ethnically Indian or South Asian, but don't live in India. I mean, technically we're not nationals of India, we're American citizens, but I would say the NRI term is a bit of a scope that includes all ethnic South Asians whose families come from India. And they're always saying in the news and these politicians, oh, these NRIs are, Khalistani, or these NRIs are extremists, or these NRIs are XYZ. Not realizing that majority of India's independence was led by individuals that weren't necessarily NRIs, but did get their education in other, countries. We have the Ghadri Babay, which start here in California. You have Gandhi, who himself, I believe, was a lawyer in South Africa, but he went to the University College of London. London.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that.
Yeah, and it's like his rise to fame was the fact that he was able to be a prominent editor of a newspaper in South Africa, saying things that he would not be able to say in India. Right. He was able to say it in South Africa. The gentleman, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, that wrote India's constitution, right? The guy that wrote India's constitution and was a really, prominent revolutionary. He got his PhD here in America at Columbia. So the importance of NRIs in India's independence has been forgotten, and I really hope this podcast episode, shed some light on that.
Yeah. So in this episode, we talked about the Ghadri Babay, and we're going to be talking a lot more in future episodes about these revolutionaries, the history of Udham Singh, Bhagat Singh, and stay tuned. So we're going to get a lot more into it. Thank you so much, Herman.
Thank you.